Chapter 20 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 20. The First Ride Together. My mistress bent that brow of hers, those deep dark eyes where pride demurs when pity would be softening through, fixed me a breathing while or two, with life or death in the balance, right. The blood replenished me again. My last thought was at least not vain. I and my mistress, side by side, shall be together, breathe and ride. So, one day more I am deified. Who knows but the world may end tonight? R. Browning. We shall be leaving soon, said Armitage, half to himself and partly to Oscar. It is not safe to wait much longer. He tossed a copy of the Neue Freie Presse on the table. Oscar had been down to the Springs to explore, and brought back news, gained from the stableman at the hotel, that Chauvenet had left the hotel, presumably for Washington. It was now Wednesday, in the third week in April. Oscar, you were a clever boy, and knew more than you were told. You have asked me no questions. There may be an ugly row before I get out of these hills. I should not think hard of you if you preferred to leave. I enlisted for the campaign. Yes. I shall wait until I am discharged. And the little man buttoned his coat. Thank you, Oscar. In a few more days we shall probably be through with this business. There's another man coming to get into the game. He reached Washington yesterday, and we shall doubtless hear of him shortly. Very likely they are both in the hills tonight. And Oscar, listen carefully to what I say. The soldier drew near to Armitage, who sat swinging his legs on the table in the bungalow. If I should die unshriven during the next week, here's a key that opens a safety vault box at the Bronx Loan and Trust Company in New York. In case I am disabled, go at once with the key to Baron von Marhof, ambassador of Austria-Hungary, and tell him. He paused for a moment as though pondering his words with care. Then he laughed and went on. Tell him, Oscar, that there's a message in that safety box from a gentleman who might have been king. Oscar stared at Armitage blankly. That is the truth, Sergeant. The message once in the good Baron's hands will undoubtedly give him a severe shock. You will do well to go to bed. I shall take a walk before I turn in. You should not go out alone. Don't trouble about me. I shan't go far. I think we are safe until two gentlemen have met in Washington, discussed their affairs, and come down into the mountains again. The large brute we caught the other night is undoubtedly on the watch near by, but he is harmless. Only a few days more and we shall perform a real service in the world, Sergeant. I feel it in my bones. He took his hat from a bench by the door and went out upon the veranda. The moon had already slipped down behind the mountains, but the stars trooped brightly across the heavens. He drank deep breaths of the cool air of the mountain night, and felt the dark wooing him with calm and peace. He returned for his cloak and walked into the wood. He followed the road to the gate, then turned toward the port of missing men. He had formed quite definite plans of what he should do in certain emergencies, and he felt a new strength in his confidence that he should succeed in the business that had brought him into the hills. At the abandoned bridge he threw himself down and gazed off through a narrow cut that afforded a glimpse of the Springs, where the electric lights gleamed as one lamp. Shirley Claiborne was there in the valley, and he smiled with the thought of her, for soon, perhaps in a few hours, he would be free to go to her, his work done, and no mystery or dangerous task would henceforth lie between them. He saw march before him across the night great hosts of armed men, singing hymns of war, and again he looked upon cities besieged, still again upon armies in long alignment, waiting for the word that would bring the final shock of battle. The faint roar of water far below added an undernote of reality to his dream, and still he saw, as upon a tapestry held in his hand, the struggles of kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires. Upon the wide seas smoke floated from the guns of giant ships that strove mightily in battle. He was thrilled by drum beats and the cry of trumpets. Then his mood changed, and the mountains and calm stars spoke an heroic language that was of newer and nobler things, and he shook his head impatiently, and gathered his cloak about him, and rose. "God said, I am tired of kings," he muttered. "But I shall keep my pledge. I shall do Austria a service," he said, and then laughed a little to himself. "To think that it may be for me to say." And with this he walked quite to the brink of the chasm, and laid his hand upon the iron cable from which swung the bridge. "I shall soon be free," he said with a deep sigh, and looked across the star-lighted hills. Then the cable under his hand vibrated slightly. At first he thought it the night wind stealing through the veil and swaying the bridge above the sheer depth. But still he felt the tingle of the iron rope in his clasp, and his hold tightened, and he bent forward to listen. The whole bridge now audibly shook with the pulsation of a step, a soft, furtive step, as of one cautiously groping a way over the unsubstantial flooring. Then, through the starlight, he distinguished a woman's figure, and drew back. A loose plank in the bridge floor rattled, and as she passed it freed itself, and he heard it strike the rocks faintly far below. But the figure stole swiftly on, and he bent forward with a cry of warning on his lips, and snatched away the light barricade that had been nailed across the opening. When he looked up, his words of rebuke, that had waited only for the woman's security, died on his lips. "Shirley!" he cried, and put forth both hands and lifted her to firm ground. A little sigh of relief broke from her. The bridge still swayed from her weight, and the cables hummed like the wires of a harp. Near at hand the waterfall tumbled down through the mystical starlight. "I did not know that dreams really came true," he said, with an awe in his voice that the passing fear had left behind. She began abruptly, not heeding his words. "You must go away, at once. I came to tell you that you cannot stay here." "But it is unfair to accept any warning from you. You are too generous, too kind," he began. "It is not generosity or kindness, but this danger that follows you. It is an evil thing, and it must not find you here. It is impossible that such a thing can be in America. But you must go. You must seek the law's aid." "How do you know I dare?" "I don't know that you dare." "I know that you have a great heart, and that I love you," he said. She turned quickly toward the bridge as though to retrace her steps. "I can't be paid for a very slight service by fair words, Mr. Armitage. If you knew why I came—" "If I dared think, or believe, or hope—" "You will dare nothing of the kind, Mr. Armitage," she replied. "But I will tell you that I came out of ordinary Christian humanity. The idea of friends, of even slight acquaintances, being assassinated in these Virginia hills does not please me." "How do you classify me, please? With friends or acquaintances?" He laughed. Then the gravity of what she was doing changed his tone. "I am John Armitage, that is all you know, and yet you hazard your life to warn me that I am in danger?" "If you called yourself John Smith, I should do exactly the same thing. It makes not the slightest difference to me who or what you are." "You are explicit," he laughed. "I don't hesitate to tell you that I value your life much higher than you do." "That is quite unnecessary. It may amuse you to know that, as I am a person of little curiosity, I am not the least concerned in the solution of what might be called the Armitage riddle." "Oh, I'm a riddle, am I?" "Not to me, I assure you. You are only the object of someone's enmity, and there's something about murder that isn't exactly nice. It's positively unaesthetic." She had begun seriously, but laughed at the absurdity of her last words. "You are amazingly impersonal. You would save a man's life without caring in the least what manner of man he may be." "You put it rather flatly, but that's about the truth of the matter. Do you know, I am almost afraid—" "Not of me, I hope." "Certainly not. But it has occurred to me that you may have the conceit of your own mystery, that you may take rather too much pleasure in mystifying people as to your identity." "That is unkind. That is unkind." And he spoke without resentment, but softly, with a falling cadence. He suddenly threw down the hat he had held in his hand, and extended his arms toward her. You are not unkind or unjust. You have a right to know who I am and what I am doing here. It seems an impertinence to thrust my affairs upon you, but if you will listen, I should like to tell you. It will take but a moment. Why and what. Please do not. As I told you, I have no curiosity in the matter. I can't allow you to tell me. I really don't want to know. I am willing that everyone should know. Tomorrow, or the day after, not later. She lifted her head, as though with the earnestness of some new thought. The day after may be too late. Whatever it is that you have done. I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I swear I have not. Whatever it is, and I don't care what it is, she said deliberately, it is something quite serious, Mr. Armitage. My brother—" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke rapidly. "My brother has been detailed to help in the search for you. He is at Storm Springs now." "But he doesn't understand." "My brother is a soldier, and it is not necessary for him to understand." "And you have done this? You have come to warn me?" "It does look pretty bad," she said, changing her tone and laughing a little. "But my brother and we always had very different ideas about you, Mr. Armitage. We hold briefs for different sides of the case." "Oh, I'm a case, am I?" And he caught gladly at the suggestion of lightness in her tone. "But I'd really like to know what he has to do with my affairs." "Then you will have to ask him." "To be sure, but the government can hardly have assigned Captain Claiborne to special duty at Monsieur Chauvenet's request. I swear to you that I'm as much in the dark as you are." "I'm quite sure an officer of the line would not be taken from his duties and sent into the country on any frivolous errand. But perhaps an ambassador from a great power made the request. Perhaps, for example, it was Baron von Marhof." "Good Lord!" Armitage laughed aloud. "I beg your pardon. I really beg your pardon. But is the ambassador looking for me?" "I don't know, Mr. Armitage. You forget that I'm only a traitor and not a spy." "You are the noblest woman in the world," he said boldly, and his heart leaped in him, and he spoke on with fierce haste. "You have made sacrifices for me that no woman ever made before for a man she did not know, and my life, whatever it is worth, every hour and second of it, I lay down before you, and it is yours to keep or throw away. I followed you halfway round the world, and I shall follow you again, and as long as I live, and tomorrow, or the day after, I shall justify these great kindnesses, this generous confidence. But tonight I have work to do." As they stood on the verge of the defile, by the bridge that swung out from the cliff like a fairy structure, they heard far and faint the whistle and low rumble of the night train southbound from Washington, and to both of them the sound urged the very real and practical world from which for a little time they had stolen away. "I must go back," said Shirley, and turned to the bridge and put her hand on its slight iron frame, but he seized her wrists and held them tight. "You have risked much for me, but you shall not risk your life again, in my cause. You cannot venture across that bridge again." She yielded without further parley, and he dropped her wrists at once. "Please say no more. You must not make me sorry I came. I must go. I should have gone back instantly." "But not across that spider's web. You must go by the long road. I will give you a horse and ride with you into the valley." "It is much nearer by the bridge. I have my horse over there." "We shall get the horse without trouble," he said, and she walked beside him through the star-lighted wood. As they crossed the open tract, she said, "This is the port of missing men." "Yes, here the Lost Legion made its last stand. There lie the graves of some of them. It's a pretty story. I hope some day to know more of it from some such authority as yourself." "I used to ride here on my pony when I was a little girl, and dream about the gray soldiers who would not surrender. It was as beautiful as an old ballad. I'll wait here. Fetch the horse," she said, "and hurry, please." "If there are explanations to make—" he began, looking at her gravely. "I am not a person who makes explanations, Mr. Armitage. You may meet me at the gate." As he ran toward the house he met Oscar, who had become alarmed at his absence and was setting forth in search of him. "Come, saddle both the horses, Oscar. Armitage commanded. They went together to the barn and quickly brought out the horses. You are not to come with me, Oscar. A captain does not go alone. It should be the sergeant who is sent, yes? It is not an affair of war, Oscar, but quite another matter. There is a saddled horse hitched to the other side of our abandoned bridge. Get it and ride it to Judge Claiborne's stables, and ask and answer no questions. A moment later he was riding toward the gate, the led horse following. He flung himself down, adjusted the stirrups, and gave her a hand to the saddle. They turned silently into the mountain road. The bridge would have been simpler and quicker, said Shirley. As it is, I shall be late to the ball. I am contrite enough, but you don't make explanations. No, I don't explain. And you are to come back as soon as we strike the valley. I always send gentlemen back at that point, she laughed, and went ahead of him into the narrow road. She guided the strange horse with the ease of long practice, skillfully testing his paces, and when they came to a stretch of smooth road, sent him flying at a gallop over the trail. He had given her his own horse, a hunter of famous strain, and she at once defined and maintained a distance between him that made all talk impossible. Her short covert riding-coat, buttoned close, marked clearly in the starlight her erect figure. Light wisps of loosened hair broke free under her soft felt hat, and when she turned her head the wind caught the brim and pressed it back from her face, giving a new charm to her profile. He called after her once or twice at the start, but she did not pause or reply, and he could not know what mood possessed her, or that once in flight, in the security the horse gave her, she was for the first time afraid of him. He had declared his love for her, and had offered to break down the veil of mystery that made him a strange and perplexing figure. His affairs, whatever their nature, were now at a crisis, he had said. Quite possibly she should never see him again after this ride. As she waited at the gate she had known a moment of contrition and doubt as to what she had done. It was not fair to her brother thus to give away his secret to the enemy, but as the horse flew down the rough road her blood leaped with the sense of adventure, and her pulse sang with the joy of flight. Her thoughts were free, wild things, and she exulted in the great starry vaults and the cool heights over which she rode. Who was John Armitage? She did not know or care, now that she had performed for him her last service. Quite likely he would fade away on the morrow like a mountain shadow before the sun, and the song in her heart to-night was not love or anything akin to it, but only the joy of living. Where the road grew difficult as it dipped sharply down into the valley, she suffered him perforce to ride beside her. You ride wonderfully, he said. The horse is a joy. He's a Pendragon. I know them in the dark. He must have come from this valley somewhere. We own some of his cousins, I'm sure. You are quite right. He's a Virginia horse. You are incomparable. No other woman alive could have kept that pace. It's a brave woman who isn't a slave to her hairpins. I don't believe you spilled one. She drew rein at the crossroads. We part here. How shall I return Bucephalus? Let me go to your own gate, please. Not at all, she said with decision. Then Oscar will pick him up. If you don't see him, turn the horse loose. But my thanks, for oh, so many things, he pleaded. Tomorrow, or the day after, or never. She laughed and put out her hand, and when he tried to detain her she spoke to the horse and flashed away toward home. He listened, marking her flight until the shadows of the valleys stole sound and sight from him. Then he turned back into the hills. Near her father's estate Shirley came upon a man who saluted her in the manner of a soldier. It was Oscar, who had crossed the bridge and ridden down by the nearer road. It is my captain's horse, yes, he said, as the slim, graceful animal whinnied and pawed the ground. I found a horse at the broken bridge, and took it to your stable, yes? A moment later Shirley walked rapidly through the garden to the veranda of her father's house, where her brother Dick paced back and forth impatiently. Where have you been, Shirley? Walking. But you went for a ride. The stableman told me. I believe that is true, Captain. And your horse was brought home half an hour ago by a strange fellow who saluted like a soldier when I spoke to him, but refused to understand my English. Well, they do say English isn't very well taught at West Point, Captain, she replied, pulling off her gloves. You oughtn't to blame the polite stranger for his courtesy." "I believe you have been up to some mischief, Shirley. If you are seeing that man Armitage—" "Captain!" "Bah! What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to the ball with you as soon as I change my gown. I suppose father and mother have gone?" "They have, for which you should be grateful." Captain Claiborne lighted a cigar and waited. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 21. The Comedy of a Sheepfold. A glance, a word, and joy or pain befalls. How slight the links are in the chain that binds us to our destiny. T.B. Aldrich. Oscar's eyes, roaming the landscape as he left Shirley Claiborne and started for the bungalow, swept the upland Claiborne acres and rested upon a moving shadow. He drew rein under a clump of wild cherry trees at the roadside and waited. Several hundred yards away lay the Claiborne sheepfold, with a broad pasture rising behind. A shadow is not a thing to be ignored by a man trained in the niceties of scouting. Oscar satisfied himself that substance lay behind the shadow, dismounted and tied his horse. Then he bent low over the stone wall and watched. "It is the big fellow, yes? He is a stealer of sheep, as I might have known." Zmai was only a dim figure against the dark meadow, which he was slowly crossing from the side farthest from the Claiborne house. He stopped several times as though uncertain of his whereabouts, and then clambered over a stone wall that formed one side of the sheepfold, passed it and strode on toward Oscar and the road. "It is mischief that brings him from the hills, yes?" Oscar reflected, glancing up and down the highway. Faintly, very softly through the night, he heard the orchestra at the hotel, playing for the dance. The little soldier unbuttoned his coat, drew the revolver from his belt, and thrust it into his coat pocket. Zmai was drawing nearer, advancing rapidly now that he had gained his bearings. At the wall, Oscar rose suddenly and greeted him in mockingly courteous tones. "Good evening, friend. It is a fine evening for a walk." Zmai drew back and growled. "Let me pass," he said in his difficult German. "It is a long wall. There should be no difficulty in passing. This country is much freer than Servia, yes?" And Oscar's tone was pleasantly conversational. Zmai put his hand on the wall and prepared to vault. "A moment only, comrade. You seem to be in a hurry. It must be a business that brings you from the mountains, yes?" "I have no time for you," snarled the Servian. "Begone!" And he shook himself impatiently and again put his hand on the wall. "One should not be in too much haste, comrade." And Oscar thrust Zmai back with his fingertips. The man yielded and ran a few steps out of the clump of trees and sought to escape there. It was clear to Oscar that Zmai was not anxious to penetrate closer to the Claiborne house, whose garden extended quite near. He met Zmai promptly and again thrust him back. "It is a message, yes?" asked Oscar. "It is my affair," blurted the big fellow. "I mean no harm to you." "It was you that tried the knife on my body. It is much quieter than shooting. You have the knife, yes?" The little soldier whipped out his revolver. "In which pocket is the business carried? A letter, undoubtedly. They do not trust swine to carry words. Ah!" Oscar dropped below the wall as Zmai struck at him, and when he looked up a moment later the Servian was running back over the meadow toward the sheepfold. Oscar, angry at the ease with which the Servian had evaded him, leaped the wall and set off after the big fellow. He was quite sure that the man bore a written message, and equally sure that it must be of importance to his employer. He clutched his revolver tight, brought up his elbows for greater ease in running, and sped after Zmai, now a blur on the starlighted sheep pasture. The slope was gradual and a pretty feature of the landscape by day, but it afforded a toilsome path for runners. Zmai already realized that he had blundered in not forcing the wall. He was running uphill with a group of sheds, another wall, and a still steeper and rougher field beyond. His bulk told against him, and behind him he heard the quick thump of Oscar's feet on the turf. The starlight grew dimmer through tracks of white scud. The surface of the pasture was rougher to the feet than it appeared to the eye. A hound in the Claiborne stable yard bayed suddenly, and the sound echoed from the surrounding houses and drifted off toward the sheepfold. Then a noble music rose from the kennels. Captain Claiborne, waiting for his sister on the veranda, looked toward the stables, listening. Zmai approached the sheep sheds rapidly, with still 100 yards to traverse beyond them before he should reach the pasture wall. His rage at thus being driven by a small man for whom he had great contempt did not help his wind or stimulate the flight of his heavy legs, and he saw now that he would lessen the narrowing margin between himself and his pursuer if he swerved to the right to clear the sheds. He suddenly slacked his pace, and with a vigorous tug settled his wool hat more firmly upon his small skull. He went now at a dog trot, and Oscar was closing upon him rapidly. Then, quite near the sheds, Zmai wheeled about and charged his pursuer headlong. At the moment he turned, Oscar's revolver bit keenly into the night. Captain Claiborne, looking toward the slope, saw the flash before the hounds at the stables answered the report. At the shot Zmai cried aloud in his curiously small voice, and clapped his hands to his head. "Stop! I want the letter!" shouted Oscar in German. The man turned slowly, as though dazed, and, with a hand still clutching his head, half stumbled and half ran toward the sheds, with Oscar at his heels. Claiborne called to the negro stablemen to quiet the dogs, snatched a lantern, and ran away through the pergola to the end of the garden, and thence into the pasture beyond. Meanwhile Oscar, thinking Zmai badly hurt, did not fire again, but flung himself upon the fellow's broad shoulders, and down they crashed against the door of the nearest pen. Zmai swerved and shook himself free while he fiercely cursed his foe. Oscar's hand slipped on the fellow's hot blood that ran from a long crease in the side of his head. As they fell, the pen door snapped free, and out into the starry pasture thronged the frightened sheep. "The letter! Give me the letter!" commanded Oscar, his face close to the Servian's. He did not know how badly the man was injured, but he was anxious to complete his business and be off. Still the sheep came huddling through the broken door, across the prostrate men, and scampered away into the open. Captain Claiborne, running toward the fold with his lantern, and not looking for obstacles, stumbled over their bewildered advance guard and plunged headlong into the gray fleeces. Meanwhile, into the pockets of his prostrate foe went Oscar's hands, with no result. Then he remembered the man's gesture in pulling the hat close upon his ears, and off came the hat and with it a blood-stained envelope. The last sheep in the pen trooped out and galloped toward its comrades. Oscar, making off with the letter, plunged into the rear guard of the sheep, fell, stumbled to his feet, and confronted Captain Claiborne as that gentleman, in soiled evening dress, fumbled for his lantern and swore in language unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. "Damn the sheep!" roared Claiborne. "It is sheep, yes?" and Oscar started to bolt. "Halt!" The authority of the tone rang familiarly in Oscar's ears. He had, after considerable tribulation, learned to stop short when an officer spoke to him, and the gentleman of the sheepfold stood straight in the starlight and spoke like an officer. "What in the devil are you doing here, and who fired that shot?" Oscar saluted and summoned his best English. "It was an accident, sir." "Why are you running, and why did you fire? Understand you are a trespasser here, and I am going to turn you over to the constable." "There was a sheep-stealer, yes? He is yonder by the pens, and we had some little fighting. But he is not dead, no?" At that moment Captain Claiborne's eyes caught sight of a burly figure rising and threshing about by the broken pen door. "That is the sheep-stealer," said Oscar. "We should catch him, yes?" Zmai peered toward them, uncertain for a moment, then turned abruptly and ran toward the road. Oscar started to cut off his retreat, but Claiborne caught the sergeant by the shoulder and flung him back. "One of you at a time. They can turn the hounds on the other rascal. What's that you have there? Give it to me, quick." "It's a piece of wool." But Captain Claiborne snatched the paper from Oscar's hand, and commanded the man to march ahead of him to the house. So over the meadow and through the pergola they went, across the veranda and into the library. The power of army discipline was upon Oscar. If Claiborne had not been an officer he would have run for it in the garden. As it was, he was taxing his wits to find some way out of his predicament. He had not the slightest idea as to what the paper might be. He had risked his life to secure it, and now the crumpled, blood-stained paper had been taken away from him by a person whom it could not interest in any way whatever. He blinked under Claiborne's sharp scrutiny as they faced each other in the library. "You are the man who brought a horse back to our stable an hour ago." "Yes, sir." "You have been a soldier." "In the cavalry, sir. I have my discharge at home." "Where do you live?" "I work as a teamster in the coal mines, yes. They are by Lamar, sir." Claiborne studied Oscar's erect figure carefully. "Let me see your hands," he commanded, and Oscar extended his palms. "You are lying. You do not work in the coal mines. Your clothes are not those of a miner, and a discharged soldier doesn't go to digging coal. Stand where you are, and it will be the worse for you if you try to bolt." Claiborne turned to the table with the envelope. It was not sealed, and he took out the plain sheet of notepaper on which was written, "Cablegram. Winkelried, Vienna. Not later than Friday. Chauvenet." Claiborne read and reread these 8 words. Then he spoke bluntly to Oscar. "Where did you get this?" "From the hat of the sheep-stealer up yonder." "Who is he, and where did he get it?" "I don't know, sir. He was of Servia, and they are an ugly race, yes." "What were you going to do with the paper?" Oscar grinned. "If I could read it, yes, I might know. But if Austria is in the paper, then it is mischief, and maybe it would be murder. Who knows?" Claiborne looked frowningly from the paper to Oscar's tranquil eyes. "Dick!" called Shirley from the hall, and she appeared in the doorway, drawing on her gloves but pausing at seeing Oscar. "Shirley, I caught this man in the sheepfold. Did you ever see him before?" "I think not, Dick." "It was he that brought your horse home." "To be sure, it is. I hadn't recognized him. Thank you very much," and she smiled at Oscar. Dick frowned fiercely and referred again to the paper. "Where is Monsieur Chauvenet? Have you any idea?" "If he isn't at the hotel or in Washington, I'm sure I don't know. If we are going to the dance—" "Plague the dance! I heard a shot in the sheep pasture a bit ago, and ran out to find this fellow in a row with another man, who got away." "I heard the shot and the dogs from my window. You seem to have been in a fuss, too, from the looks of your clothes." And Shirley sat down and smoothed her gloves with provoking coolness. Dick sent Oscar to the far end of the library with a gesture, and held up the message for Shirley to read. "Don't touch it!" he exclaimed, and when she nodded her head in a sign that she had read it, he said, speaking earnestly and rapidly, "I suppose I have no right to hold this message. I must send the man to the hotel telegraph office with it. But where is Chauvenet? What is his business in this valley? And what is the link between Vienna and these hills?" "Don't you know what you are doing here?" she asked, and he flushed. "I know what, but not why," he blurted irritably. "But that's enough." "You know that Baron von Marhof wants to find John Armitage, but you don't know why." "I have my orders, and I'm going to find him, if it takes 10 years." Shirley nodded and clasped her fingers together. Her elbows resting on the high arms of her chair caused her cloak to flow sweepingly away from her shoulders. At the end of the room, with his back to the portieres, stood Oscar, immovable. Claiborne re-examined the message and extended it again to Shirley. "There's no doubt of that being Chauvenet's writing, is there?" "I think not, Dick. I have had notes from him now and then in that hand. He has taken pains to write this with unusual distinctness." The color brightened in her cheeks suddenly as she looked toward Oscar. The curtains behind him swayed, but so did the curtain back of her. A Maytime languor had crept into the heart of April, and all the windows were open. The blurred murmurs of insects stole into the house. Oscar, half forgotten by his captor, heard a sound in the window behind him, and a hand touched him through the curtain. Claiborne crumpled the paper impatiently. "Shirley, you are against me. I believe you have seen Armitage here, and I want you to tell me what you know of him. It's not like you to shield a scamp of an adventurer, an unknown, questionable character. He has followed you to this valley, and will involve you in his affairs without the slightest compunction, if he can. It's most infamous, outrageous, and when I find him I'm going to thrash him within an inch of his life before I turn him over to Marhof." Shirley laughed for the first time in their interview, and rose and placed her hands on her brother's shoulders. "Do it, Dick. He's undoubtedly a wicked, terribly wicked and dangerous character." "I tell you I'll find him," he said tensely, putting up his hands to hers, where they rested on his shoulders. She laughed and kissed him, and when her hands fell to her sides the message was in her gloved fingers. "I'll help you, Dick," she said, buttoning her glove. "That's like you, Shirley." "If you want to find Mr. Armitage—" "Of course I want to find him!" His voice rose to a roar. "Then turn around. Mr. Armitage is just behind you." "Yes, I needed my man for other business," said Armitage, folding his arms, "and as you were very much occupied I made free with the rear veranda and changed places with him." Claiborne walked slowly toward him, the anger glowing in his face. "You are worse than I thought. Eavesdropper, housebreaker." "Yes, I am both of those things, Captain Claiborne, but I am also in a great hurry. What do you want with me?" "You are a rogue, an impostor." "We will grant that," said Armitage quietly. "Where is your warrant for my arrest?" "It will be forthcoming fast enough. I want you to understand that I have a personal grievance against you." "It must wait until day after tomorrow, Captain Claiborne. I will come to you here, or wherever you say, on the day after tomorrow." Armitage spoke with a deliberate sharp decision that was not the tone of a rogue or a fugitive. As he spoke he advanced until he faced Claiborne in the center of the room. Shirley stood by the window, holding the soiled paper in her hand. She had witnessed the change of men at the end of the room. It had touched her humor. It had been a joke on her brother. But she felt that the night had brought a crisis. She could not continue to shield a man of whom she knew nothing, save that he was the object of a curious enmity. Her idle prayer that her own land's commonplace sordidness might be obscured by the glamour of old-world romance came back to her. She had been in touch with an adventure that was certainly proving fruitful of diversion. The coup de théâtre by which Armitage had taken the place of his servant had amused her for a moment, but she was vexed and angry now that he had dared come again to the house. "You are under arrest, Mr. Armitage. I must detain you here," said Claiborne. "In America? In free Virginia? Without legal process?" asked Armitage, laughing. "You are a housebreaker, that is enough. Shirley, please go." "You were not detached from the army to find a housebreaker, but I will make your work easy for you. Day after tomorrow I will present myself to you wherever you say. But now, that cable message which my man found in your sheep pasture is of importance. I must trouble you to read it to me." "No!" shouted Claiborne. Armitage drew a step nearer. "You must take my word for it that matters of importance, of far-reaching consequence, hang upon that message. I must know what it is." "You certainly have magnificent cheek. I am going to take that paper to Baron von Marhof at once." "Do so. But I must know first. Baron von Marhof and I are on the same side in this business, but he doesn't understand it, and it's clear you don't. Give me the message." He spoke commandingly, his voice thrilling with earnestness, and jerked out his last words with angry impatience. At the same moment he and Claiborne stepped toward each other, with their hands clenched at their sides. "I don't like your tone, Mr. Armitage." "I don't like to use that tone, Captain Claiborne." Shirley walked quickly to the table and put down the message. Then, going to the door, she paused as though by an afterthought, and repeated quite slowly the words, "Winkelried, Vienna, not later than Friday. Chauvenet." "Shirley!" roared Claiborne. John Armitage bowed to the already vacant doorway, then bounded into the hall out upon the veranda and ran through the garden to the side gate where Oscar waited. Half an hour later Captain Claiborne, after an interview with Baron von Marhof, turned his horse toward the hills. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 22. The Prisoner at the Bungalow. So, exultant of heart, with front toward the bridges of battle, sat they the whole night long, and the fires that they kindled were many, e'en as the stars in her train, with the moon as she walketh in splendour, blaze forth in the heavens on nights when the welkin is breathless, nights when the mountain peaks, their jutting cliffs, and the valleys, are all disclosed to the eye, and above them the fathomless ether opens to star after star, and glad is the heart of the shepherd. Such and so many the fires, twixt the ships and the streams of the Xanthus, kept ablaze by the Trojans in front of the darkening city. Over the plains were burning 1,000 fires, and beside them each sat 50 men in the firelight glare, and the horses, champing their fodder and barley white, and instant for action, stood by the chariot side and awaited the glory of morning. The Iliad, translation of Prentice Cummings. In Vienna, Friday. There should be great deeds, my dear Jules. And Monsieur Durand adjusted the wick of a smoking brass lamp that hung suspended from the ceiling of a room of the inn, store, and post office at Lamar. Meanwhile, this being but Wednesday, we have our work to do. Which is not so simple after all, as one studies the situation. Mr. Armitage is here, quite within reach. We suspect him of being a person of distinction. He evidenced unusual interest in a certain document that was once in your own hands. Our own hands, if you would be accurate. You are captious, but granted so. We must get them back. The gentleman is dwelling in a bungalow on the mountain-side, for greater convenience in watching events and wooing the lady of his heart's desire. We employed a clumsy clown to put him out of the world, but he dies hard, and now we have to get rid of him. But if he doesn't have the papers on his clothes, then you have this pleasant scheme for kidnapping him, getting him down to your steamer at Baltimore, and cruising with him until he is ready to come to terms. The American air has done much for your imagination, my dear Jules, or possibly the altitude of the hills has overstimulated it. You are not the fool you look, my dear Durand. You have actually taken a pretty fair grasp of the situation. But the adorable young lady, the fair Mademoiselle Claiborne, what becomes of her in these transactions? That is none of your affair, replied Chauvenet, frowning. I am quite content with my progress. I have not finished in that matter. Neither, it would seem, has Mr. John Armitage, but I am quite well satisfied to leave it to you. In a few days we shall know much more than we do now. I should be happier if you were in charge in Vienna. A false step there. Ugh, I hate to think of the wretched mess there would be. Trust Winkelried to do his full duty. You must not forget that the acute Stroebel now sleeps the long sleep, and that many masses have already been said for the repose of his intrepid soul. The splendor of our undertaking is enough to draw his ghost from the grave. Ugh! By this time Zmai should have filed our cablegram at the Springs, and got your mail at the hotel. I hope you have not misplaced your confidence in the operator there. Coming back, our giant must pass Armitage's house. Trust him to pass it. His encounters with Armitage have not been to his credit. The two men were dressed in rough clothes, as for an outing, and in spite of the habitual trifling tone of their talk, they wore a serious air. Durand's eyes danced with excitement, and he twisted his moustache nervously. Chauvenet had gone to Washington to meet Durand, and to get from him news of the progress of the conspiracy in Vienna, and, not least, to berate him for crossing the Atlantic. I do not require watching, my dear Durand, he had said. A man in love, dear Jules, sometimes forgets. But they had gone into the Virginia hills amicably and were quartered with the postmaster. They waited now for Zmai, whom they had sent to the Springs with a message, and to get Chauvenet's mail. Armitage, they had learned, used the Lamar telegraph office, and they had decided to carry their business elsewhere. While they waited in the bare upper room of the inn for Zmai, the big Servian tramped up the mountainside with an aching head and a heart heavy with dread. The horse he had left tied in a thicket when he plunged down through the Claiborne place had broken free and run away, so that he must now trudge back afoot to report to his masters. He had made a mess of his errands and nearly lost his life besides. The bullet from Oscar's revolver had cut a neat furrow in his scalp, which was growing sore and stiff as it ceased bleeding. He would undoubtedly be dealt with harshly by Chauvenet and Durand, but he knew that the sooner he reported his calamities the better, so he stumbled toward Lamar, pausing at times to clasp his small head in his great hands. When he passed the wild tangle that hid Armitage's bungalow, he paused and cursed the two occupants in his own dialect with a fierce, vile tongue. It was near midnight when he reached the tavern and climbed the rickety stairs to the room where the two men waited. Chauvenet opened the door at his approach, and they cried aloud as the great figure appeared before them, and the lamplight fell upon his dark, blood-smeared face. "The letters!" snapped Chauvenet. "Is the message safe?" demanded Durand. "Lost. They are lost. I lost my way, and he nearly killed me, the little soldier, as I crossed a strange field." When they had jerked the truth from Zmai, Chauvenet flung open the door and bawled through the house for the innkeeper. "Horses! Saddle our 2 horses, quick, and get another if you have to steal it!" he screamed. Then he turned into the room to curse Zmai, while Durand with a towel and water sought to ease the ache in the big fellow's head and cleanse his face. "So that beggarly little servant did it, did he? He stole that paper I had given you, did he? What do you imagine I brought you to this country for, if you are to let 2 stupid fools play with you as though you were a clown?" The Servian, on his knees before Durand, suffered a torrent of abuse meekly. He was a scoundrel, hired to do murder, and his vilification by an angered employer did not greatly trouble him, particularly since he understood little of Chauvenet's rapid German. In half an hour Chauvenet was again in a fury, learning at Lamar that the operator had gone down the road 20 miles to a dance and would not be back until morning. The imperturbable Durand shivered in the night air and prodded Chauvenet with ironies. "We have no time to lose. The message must go tonight. You may be sure Monsieur Armitage will not send it for us. Come, we've got to go down to Storm Springs." They rode away in the starlight, leaving the postmaster alarmed and wondering. Chauvenet and Durand were well mounted on horses that Chauvenet had sent into the hills in advance of his own coming. Zmai rode grim and silent on a clumsy plough horse, which was the best the publican could find for him. The knife was not the only weapon he had known in Servia. He carried a potato sack across his saddle-bow. Chauvenet and Durand sent him ahead to set the pace with his inferior mount. They talked together in low tones as they followed. "He's not such a big fool, this Armitage," remarked Durand. "He is quite deep, in fact. I wish it were he we are trying to establish on a throne, and not that pitiful scapegrace in Vienna. I gave him his chance down there in the valley, and he laughed at me. It is quite possible that he is not a fool, and quite certain that he is not a coward. And then he would not be a safe king. Our young friend in Vienna is a good deal of a fool, and altogether a coward. We shall have to provide him with a spine at his coronation." "If we fail," began Chauvenet. "You suggest a fruitful but unpleasant topic. If we fail, we shall be fortunate if we reach the hospitable shores of the Argentine for future residence. Paris and Vienna would not know us again. If Winkelried succeeds in Vienna, and we lose here, where do we arrive?" "We arrive quite where Mr. Armitage chooses to land us. He is a gentleman of resources. He has money. He laughs cheerfully at misadventures. He has had you watched by the shrewdest eyes in Europe, and you are considered a hard man to keep track of, my dear Durand. And not least important, he has tonight snatched away that little cablegram that was the signal to Winkelried to go ahead. He is a very annoying and vexatious person, this Armitage. Even Zmai, whose knife made him a terror in Servia, seems unable to cope with him. And the fair daughter of the valley? Psh, we are not discussing the young lady. I can understand how unpleasant the subject must be to you, my dear Jules. What do you imagine she knows of Monsieur Armitage? If he is the man we think he is, and a possible heir to a great throne, it would be impossible for her to marry him. His tastes are democratic. In Montana he is quite popular. Durand flung away his cigarette and laughed suddenly. Has it occurred to you that this whole affair is decidedly amusing? Here we are, in one of the free American states, about to turn a card that will dethrone a king, if we are lucky. And here is a man we are trying to get out of the way, a man we might make king if he were not a fool. In America! It touches my sense of humor, my dear Jules. An exclamation from Zmai arrested them. The Servian jerked up his horse, and they were instantly at his side. They had reached a point near the hunting preserve in the main highway. It was about 1:30, an hour at which Virginia mountain roads are usually free of travelers, and they had been sending their horses along as briskly as the uneven roads and the pace of Zmai's laggard beast permitted. The beat of a horse's hoofs could be heard quite distinctly in the road ahead of them. The road tended downward, and the strain of the ascent was marked in the approaching animal's walk. In a moment the three men heard the horse's quick snort of satisfaction as it reached leveler ground. Then, scenting the other animals, it threw up its head and neighed shrilly. In the dusk of starlight Durand saw Zmai dismount, and felt the Servian's big rough hand touch his in passing the bridle of his horse. "Wait," said the Servian. The horse of the unknown paused, neighed again, and refused to go farther. A man's deep voice encouraged him in low tones. The horses of Chauvenet's party danced about restlessly, responsive to the nervousness of the strange beast before them. "Who goes there?" The stranger's horse was quiet for an instant, and the rider had forced him so near that the beast's up-reined head and the erect shoulders of the horseman were quite clearly defined. "Who goes there?" shouted the rider, while Chauvenet and Durand bent their eyes toward him, their hands tight on their bridles, and listened, waiting for Zmai. They heard a sudden rush of steps, the impact of his giant body as he flung himself upon the shrinking horse, and then a cry of alarm and rage. Chauvenet slipped down and ran forward with the quick, soft glide of a cat, and caught the bridle of the stranger's horse. The horseman struggled in Zmai's great arms, and the beast plunged wildly. No words passed. The rider had kicked his feet out of the stirrups and gripped the horse hard with his legs. His arms were flung up to protect his head, over which Zmai tried to force the sack. "The knife?" bawled the Servian. "No," answered Chauvenet. "The devil!" yelled the rider, and dug his spurs into the rearing beast's flanks. Chauvenet held on valiantly with both hands to the horse's head. Once the frightened beast swung him clear of the ground. A few yards distant Durand sat on his own horse and held the bridles of the others. He soothed the restless animals in low tones, the light of his cigarette shaking oddly in the dark with the movement of his lips. The horse ceased to plunge. Zmai held its rider erect with his left arm, while the right drew the sack down over the head and shoulders of the prisoner. "Tie him," said Chauvenet, and Zmai buckled a strap around the man's arms and bound them tight. The dust in the bag caused the man inside to cough, but save for the one exclamation he had not spoken. Chauvenet and Durand conferred in low tones while Zmai drew out a tether strap and snapped it to the curb bit of the captive's horse. "The fellow takes it pretty coolly," remarked Durand, lighting a fresh cigarette. "What are you going to do with him?" "We will take him to his own place. It is near, and coax the papers out of him. Then we'll find a precipice and toss him over. It's a simple matter." Zmai handed Chauvenet the revolver he had taken from the silent man on the horse. "I am ready," he reported. "Go ahead. We follow." And they started toward the bungalow, Zmai riding beside the captive and holding fast to the led horse. Where the road was smooth they sent the horses forward at a smart trot, but the captive accepted the gait. He found the stirrups again and sat in the saddle straight. He coughed now and then, but the hemp sack was sufficiently porous to give him a little air. As they rode off his silent submission caused Durand to ask, "Are you sure of the man, my dear Jules?" "Undoubtedly. I didn't get a square look at him, but he's a gentleman by the quality of his clothes. He's the same build. It is not a plough horse, but a thoroughbred he's riding. The gentlemen of the valley are in their beds long ago." Would that we were in ours. The spring nights are cold in these hills. The work is nearly done. The little soldier is yet to reckon with, but we are three, and Zmai did quite well with the potato sack. Chauvenet rode ahead and addressed a few words to Zmai. The little man must be found before we finish. There must be no mistake about it. They exercised greater caution as they drew nearer the wood that concealed the bungalow, and Chauvenet dismounted, opened the gate, and set a stone against it to ensure a ready egress. Then they walked their horses up the driveway. Admonished by Chauvenet, Durand threw away his cigarette with a sigh. You are convinced this is the wise course, dear Jules? Be quiet and keep your eyes open. There's the house. He halted the party, dismounted, and crept forward to the bungalow. He circled the veranda, found the blinds open, and peered into the long lounging room, where a few embers smouldered in the broad fireplace, and an oil lamp shed a faint light. One man they held captive, the other was not in sight. Chauvenet's courage rose at the prospect of easy victory. He tried the door, found it unfastened, and with his revolver ready in his hand threw it open. Then he walked slowly toward the table, turned the wick of the lamp high, and surveyed the room carefully. The doors of the rooms that opened from the apartment stood ajar, and he followed the wall cautiously, kicked them open, peered into the room where Armitage's things were scattered about, and found his iron bed empty. Then he walked quickly to the veranda and summoned the others. Bring him in, he said without taking his eyes from the room. A moment later Zmai had lifted the silent rider to the veranda and flung him across the threshold. Durand, now aroused, fastened the horses to the veranda rail. Chauvenet caught up some candles from the mantel and lighted them. Open the trunks in these rooms and be quick. I will join you in a moment. And as Durand turned into Armitage's room, Chauvenet peered again into the other chambers, called once or twice in a low tone, then turned to Zmai and the prisoner. Take off the bag, he commanded. Chauvenet studied the lines of the erect, silent figure as Zmai loosened the strap, drew off the bag, and stepped back toward the table on which he had laid his revolver for easier access. Mr. John Armitage. Chauvenet, his revolver half raised, had begun an ironical speech, but the words died on his lips. The man who stood blinking from the sudden burst of light was not John Armitage, but Captain Claiborne. The perspiration on Claiborne's face had made a paste of the dirt from the potato sack, which gave him a weird appearance. He grinned broadly, adding a fantastic horror to his visage which caused Zmai to leap back toward the door. Then Chauvenet cried aloud, a cry of anger, which brought Durand into the hall at a jump. Claiborne shrugged his shoulders, shook the blood into his numbed arms, then turned his besmeared face toward Durand and laughed. He laughed long and loud as the stupefaction deepened on the faces of the two men. The objects which Durand held caused Claiborne to stare, and then he laughed again. Durand had caught up from a hook in Armitage's room a black cloak, so long that it trailed at length from his arms, its red lining glowing brightly where it lay against the outer black. From the folds of the cloak a sword, plucked from a trunk, dropped upon the floor with a gleam of its bright scabbard. In his right hand he held a silver box of orders, and as his arm fell at the sight of Claiborne, the gay ribbons and gleaming pendants flashed to the floor. It is not Armitage. We have made a mistake, muttered Chauvenet tamely, his eyes falling from Claiborne's face to the cloak, the sword, the tangled heap of ribbons on the floor. Durand stepped forward with an oath. Who is the man? He demanded. It is my friend, Captain Claiborne. We owe the gentleman an apology, Chauvenet began. You put it mildly, cried Claiborne in English, his back to the fireplace, his arms folded, and the smile gone from his face. I don't know your companions, Monsieur Chauvenet, but you seem inclined to the gentle art of kidnapping and murder. Really, monsieur. It is a mistake. It is unpardonable. I can only offer you reparation. Anything you ask, stammered Chauvenet. You are looking for John Armitage, are you? Demanded Claiborne hotly, without heeding Chauvenet's words. Mr. Armitage is not here. He was in Storm Springs tonight, at my house. He is a brave gentleman, and I warn you that you will injure him at your peril. You may kill me here, or strangle me, or stick a knife into me, if you would be better satisfied that way, or you may kill him and hide his body in these hills. But, by God, there will be no escape for you. The highest powers of my government know that I am here. Baron von Marhof knows that I am here. I have an engagement to breakfast with Baron von Marhof at his house at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if I am not there every agency of the government will be put to work to find you, Mr. Jules Chauvenet, and these other scoundrels who travel with you." "You are violent, my dear sir," began Durand, whose wits were coming back to him much quicker than Chauvenet's. "I am not as violent as I shall be if I get a troop of cavalry from Port Meyer down here and hunt you like rabbits through the hills. I advise you to cable Winkelried at Vienna that the game is all off." Chauvenet suddenly jumped toward the table, the revolver still swinging at arm's length. "You know too much." "I don't know any more than Armitage and Baron von Marhof and my father and the Honorable Secretary of State, to say nothing of the equally Honorable Secretary of War." Claiborne stretched out his arms and rested them along the shelf of the mantel, and smiled with a smile which the dirt on his face weirdly accented. His hat was gone, his short hair rumpled. He dug the bricks of the hearth with the toe of his riding boot as an emphasis of his contentment with the situation. "You don't understand the gravity of our labors. The peace of a great empire is at stake in this business. We are engaged on a patriotic mission of great importance." It was Durand who spoke. Outside, Zmai held the horses in readiness. "You are a fine pair of patriots, I swear," said Claiborne. "What in the devil do you want with John Armitage?" "He is a menace to a great throne, an impostor, a—" Chauvenet's eyes swept with a swift glance the cloak, the sword, the scattered orders. Claiborne followed the man's gaze, but he looked quickly toward Durand and Chauvenet, not wishing them to see that the sight of these things puzzled him. "Pretty trinkets, but such games as yours, these pretty baubles, are not for these free hills." "Where is John Armitage?" Chauvenet half raised his right arm as he spoke, and the steel of his revolver flashed. Claiborne did not move. He smiled upon them, recrossed his legs, and settled his back more comfortably against the mantel-shelf. "I really forget where he said he would be at this hour. He and his men may have gone to Washington, or they may have started for Vienna, or they may be in conference with Baron von Marhof at my father's, or they may be waiting for you at the gate. The Lord only knows." "Come, we waste time," said Durand in French. "It is a trap. We must not be caught here." "Yes, you'd better go," said Claiborne, yawning and settling himself in a new pose with his back still to the fireplace. "I don't believe Armitage will care if I use his bungalow occasionally during my sojourn in the hills, and if you will be so kind as to leave my horse well tied out there somewhere, I believe I'll go to bed. I'm sorry, Mr. Chauvenet, that I can't remember who introduced you to me and my family. I owe that person a debt of gratitude for bringing so pleasant a scoundrel to my notice." He stepped to the table, his hands in his pockets, and bowed to them. "Good night, and clear out," and he waved his arm in dismissal. "Come," said Durand peremptorily, and as Chauvenet hesitated, Durand seized him by the arm and pulled him toward the door. As they mounted and turned to go they saw Claiborne standing at the table, lighting a cigarette from one of the candles. He walked to the veranda and listened until he was satisfied that they had gone, then went in and closed the door. He picked up the cloak and sword and restored the insignia to the silver box. The sword he examined with professional interest, running his hand over the embossed scabbard, then drawing the bright blade and trying its balance and weight. As he held it thus, heavy steps sounded at the rear of the house. A door was flung open, and Armitage sprang into the room with Oscar close at his heels. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 23. The Verge of Morning. Oh, to mount again where erst I haunted, where the old red hills are bird enchanted, and the low green meadows bright with sward. And when even dies, the million tinted, and the night has come, and planets glinted, lo, the valley hollow, lamp bestarred. R.L.S. "I hope you like my things, Captain Claiborne." Armitage stood a little in advance, his hand on Oscar's arm to check the rush of the little man. Claiborne sheathed the sword and placed it on the table and folded his arms. Yes, they are very interesting. And those ribbons and that cloak, I assure you they are of excellent quality. Oscar, put a blanket on this gentleman's horse, then make some coffee and wait. As Oscar closed the door, Armitage crossed to the table, flung down his gauntlets and hat, and turned to Claiborne. I didn't expect this of you. I really didn't expect it. Now that you have found me, what the devil do you want? I don't know. I'll be damned if I know. And Claiborne grinned, so that the grotesque lines of his soiled countenance roused Armitage's slumbering wrath. You'd better find out damned quick. This is my busy night, and if you can't explain yourself, I'm going to tie you hand and foot and drop you down the well till I finish my work. Speak up. What are you doing on my grounds, in my house, at this hour of the night, prying into my affairs and rummaging in my trunks? I didn't come here, Armitage. I was brought, with a potato sack over my head. There's the sack on the floor, and any of its dirt that isn't on my face must be permanently settled in my lungs. What are you doing up here in the mountains? Why are you not at your station? The potato sack story is pretty flimsy. Do better than that, and hurry up. Armitage. As he spoke, Claiborne walked to the table and rested on his fingertips. Armitage, you and I have made some mistakes during our short acquaintance. I will tell you frankly that I have blown hot and cold about you, as I never did before with another man in my life. On the ship coming over, and when I met you in Washington, I thought well of you. Then your damned cigarette case shook my confidence in you there at the Army and Navy Club that night. And now... Damn my cigarette case, bellowed Armitage, clapping his hand to his pocket to make sure of it. That's what I say. But it was a disagreeable situation. You must admit that. It was indeed. It requires some nerve for a man to tell a circumstantial story like that to a tableful of gentlemen about one of the gentlemen. No doubt of it whatever, Mr. Claiborne. Armitage unbuttoned his cloak and jerked back the lapels impatiently. And I knew as much about Monsieur Chauvenet as I did about you, or as I do about you. What you know of him, Mr. Claiborne, is of no consequence, and what you don't know about me would fill a large volume. How did you get here, and what do you propose doing, now that you are here? I am in a hurry and have no time to waste. If I can't get anything satisfactory out of you within 2 minutes, I'm going to chuck you back into the sack. I came up here in the hills to look for you. You. You! Do you understand? Began Claiborne angrily. And as I was riding along the road about 2 miles from here, I ran into 3 men on horseback. When I stopped to parley with them and find out what they were doing, they crept up on me and grabbed my horse and put that sack over my head. They had mistaken me for you, and they brought me here, into your house, and pulled the sack off, and were decidedly disagreeable at finding they had made a mistake. One of them had gone in to ransack your effects, and when they pulled off the bag and disclosed the wrong hair, he dropped his loot on the floor. And then I told them to go to the devil, and I hope they've done it. When you came in, I was picking up your traps, and I submit that the sword is handsome enough to challenge anybody's eye. And there's all that is of the story, and I don't care a damn whether you believe it or not. Their eyes were fixed upon each other in a gaze of anger and resentment. Suddenly Armitage's tense figure relaxed. The fierce light in his eyes gave way to a gleam of humor, and he laughed long and loud. Your face, Claiborne. It's funny. It's too funny for any use. When your teeth show, it's something ghastly. For God's sake, go in there and wash your face. He made a light in his own room and plied Claiborne with towels, while he continued to break forth occasionally in fresh bursts of laughter. When they went into the hall, both men were grave. Claiborne. Armitage put out his hand, and Claiborne took it in a vigorous clasp. You don't know who I am or what I am, and I haven't got time to tell you now. It's a long story, and I have much to do. But I swear to you, Claiborne, that my hands are clean, that the game I am playing is no affair of my own, but a big thing that I have pledged myself to carry through. I want you to ride down there in the valley and keep Marhof quiet for a few hours. Tell him I know more of what's going on in Vienna than he does, and if he will only sit in a rocking chair and tell you fairy stories till morning, we can all be happy. Is it a bargain, or must I still hang your head down the well till I get through? Marhof may go to the devil. He's a lot more mysterious than even you, Armitage. These fellows that brought me up here to kill me in the belief that I was you cannot be friends of Marhof's cause. They are not. I assure you they are not. They are blackguards of the blackest dye. I believe you, Armitage. Thank you. Now your horse is at the door. Run along like a good fellow. Armitage dived into his room, caught up a carriage belt and reappeared buckling it on. Oscar, he yelled, bring in that coffee, with cups for two. He kicked off his boots and drew on light shoes and leggings. Light marching orders for the rough places. Confound that buckle. He rose and stamped his feet to settle the shoes. Your horse is at the door. That rascal Oscar will take off the blanket for you. There's a bottle of fair whiskey in the cupboard, if you'd like a nip before starting. Bless me, I forgot the coffee. They're on the table, Oscar, and never mind the chairs, he added as Oscar came in with a tin pot and the cups on a piece of plank. I'm taking the rifle, Oscar. Be sure those revolvers are loaded with the real goods. There was a great color in Armitage's face as he strode about preparing to leave. His eyes danced with excitement, and between the sentences that he jerked out half to himself he whistled a few bars from a comic opera that was making a record run on Broadway. His steps rang out vigorously from the bare pine floor. Watch the windows, Oscar. You may forgive a general anything but a surprise. Isn't that so, Claiborne? And those fellows must be pretty mad by this time. Excuse the coffee service, Claiborne. We always pour the sugar from the paper bag. Original package, you understand. And see if you can't find Captain Claiborne a hat, Oscar. With a tin cup of steaming coffee in his hand, he sat on the table dangling his legs, his hat on the back of his head, the cartridge belt strapped about his waist over a brown corduroy hunting coat. He was in a high mood, and chaffed Oscar as to the probability of their breakfasting another morning. If we die, Oscar, it shall be in a good cause. He threw aside his cup with a clatter, jumped down and caught the sword from the table, examined it critically, then sheathed it with a click. Claiborne had watched Armitage with growing impatience. He resented the idea of being thus ignored. Then he put his hand roughly on Armitage's shoulder. Armitage, intent with his own affairs, had not looked at Claiborne for several minutes, but he glanced at him now as though just recalling a duty. Lord, man, I didn't mean to throw you into the road. There's a clean bed in there that you're welcome to. Go in and get some sleep. I'm not going into the valley, roared Claiborne, and I'm not going to bed. I'm going with you, damn you. But bless your soul, man, you can't go with me. You are as ignorant as a babe of my affairs, and I'm terribly busy and have no time to talk to you. Oscar, that coffee scalded me. Claiborne, if I only had time, you know, but under existing circumstances. I repeat that I'm going with you. I don't know why I'm in this row, and I don't know what it's all about, but I believe what you say about it, and I want you to understand that I can't be put into a bag like a prize potato without taking a whack at the man who put me there. But if you should get hurt, Claiborne, it would spoil my plans. I could never face your family again, said Armitage earnestly. Take your horse and go. I'm going back to the valley when you do. Huh. Drink your coffee. Oscar, bring out the rest of the artillery and give Captain Claiborne his choice. He picked up his sword again, flung the blade from the scabbard with a swish, and cut the air with it, humming a few bars of a German drinking song. Then he broke out with, I do not think a braver gentleman, more active valiant or more valiant young, more daring or more bold, is now alive to grace this latter age with noble deeds. For my part, I may speak it to my shame, I have a truant been to chivalry. Lord, Claiborne, you don't know what's ahead of us. It's the greatest thing that ever happened. I never expected anything like this, not on my cheerfulest days. Dearest Jules is out looking for a telegraph office to pull off the Austrian end of the rumpus. Well, little good it will do him, and we'll catch him and Durand and that Servian devil and lock them up here till Marhof decides what to do with them. We're off. All ready, sir, said Oscar briskly. It's 2:30. They didn't get their message off at Lamar because the office is closed and the operator gone, and they will have kept out of the valley and away from the big inn because they are rather worried by this time and not anxious to get too near Marhof. They've probably decided to go to the next station below Lamar to do their telegraphing. Meanwhile, they haven't got me." "They had me and didn't want me," said Claiborne, mounting his own horse. "They'll have a many good things they don't want in the next 24 hours. If I hadn't enjoyed this business so much myself, we might have had some Secret Service men posted along the coast to keep a lookout for them. But it's been a great old lark. And now to catch them." Outside the preserve they paused for an instant. "They're not going to venture far from their base, which is that inn and post office where they have been rummaging my mail. I haven't studied the hills for nothing. I know short-cuts about here that are not on maps. They haven't followed the railroad north, because the valley broadens too much and there are too many people. There's a trail up here that goes over the ridge and down through a wind gap to a settlement about 5 miles south of Lamar. If I'm guessing right, we can cut around and get ahead of them and drive them back here to my land." "To the port of missing men. It was made for the business," said Claiborne. "Oscar, patrol the road here and keep an eye on the bungalow, and if you hear us forcing them down, charge from this side. I'll fire twice when I get near the port to warn you, and if you strike them first, give the same signal. Do be careful, Sergeant, how you shoot. We want prisoners, you understand, not corpses." Armitage found a faint trail, and with Claiborne struck off into the forest near the main gate of his own grounds. In less than an hour they rode out upon a low wooded ridge and drew up their panting, sweating horses, 2 shadowy vedettes against the lustral dome of stars. A keen wind whistled across the ridge and the horses pawed the unstable ground restlessly. The men jumped down to tighten their saddle girths, and then turned up their coat collars before mounting again. "Come, we're on the verge of morning," said Armitage, "and there's no time to lose." Chapter 24 of The Port of Missing Men by Meredith Nicholson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. MaryAnn. Chapter 24. The Attack in the Road. Cowards and laggards fall back, but alert to the saddle, straight, grim and abreast, vault our weather-worn galloping legion, with a stirrup-cup each to the one gracious woman that loves him. Louis Imogen Genis. There's an abandoned lumber camp down here, if I'm not mistaken, and if we've made the right turns we ought to be south of Lamar and near the railroad. Armitage passed his rein to Claiborne and plunged down the steep road to reconnoiter. "It's a strange business," Claiborne muttered half aloud. The cool air of the ridge sobered him, but he reviewed the events of the night without regret. Every young officer in the service would envy him this adventure. At military posts scattered across the continent, men whom he knew well were either abroad on duty or slept the sleep of peace. He lifted his eyes to the paling stars. Before long bugle and morning gun would announce the new day at points all along the seaboard. His West Point comrades were scattered far, and the fancy seized him that the bugle brought them together every day of their lives, as it sounded the morning calls that would soon begin echoing down the coast from Kennebec Arsenal and Fort Preble in Maine, through Meyer and Monroe to McPherson in Georgia, and back through Niagara and Wayne to Sheridan, and on to Ringgold and Robinson and Crook, zigzagging back and forth over mountain and plain to the Pacific, and thence ringing on to Alaska, and echoing away from Hawaii to lonely outposts in Asian seas. He was so intent with the thought that he hummed reveille, and was about to rebuke himself for unsoldierly behavior on duty when Armitage whistled for him to advance. "It's all right. They haven't passed yet. I met a railroad track walker down there, and he said he had seen no one between here and Lamar. Now they're handicapped by the big country horse they had to take for that Servian devil, and we can push them as hard as we like. We must get them beyond Lamar before we crowd them. And don't forget that we want to drive them into my land for the roundup. I'm afraid we're going to have a wet morning." They rode abreast beside the railroad through the narrow gap. A long freight train rumbled and rattled by, and a little later they passed a coal shaft where a begrimed night shift loaded cars under flaring torches. "Their message to Winkelried is still on this side of the Atlantic," said Armitage. "But Winkelried is in a strong room by this time, if the existing powers at Vienna are what they ought to be. I've done my best to get him there. The message would only help the case against him if they sent it." Claiborne groaned mockingly. "I suppose I'll know what it's all about when I read it in the morning papers. I like the game well enough, but it might be more amusing to know what the devil I'm fighting for." "You enlisted without reading the Articles of War, and you've got to take the consequences. You've done what you set out to do. You've found me, and you're traveling with me over the Virginia mountains to report my capture to Baron von Marhof. On the way you're going to assist in another affair that will be equally to your credit, and then if all goes well with us I'm going to give myself the pleasure of allowing Monsieur Chauvenet to tell you exactly who I am. The incident appeals to my sense of humor. I assure you I have one. Of course, if I were not a person of very great distinction, Chauvenet and his friend Durand would not have crossed the ocean and brought with them a professional assassin, skilled in the use of smothering and knifing, to do away with me. You are in luck to be alive. We are dangerously near the same size and build, and in the dark, on horseback." "That was funny. I knew that if I ran for it they'd plug me for sure, and that if I waited until they saw their mistake they would be afraid to kill me. Ugh, I still taste the red soil of the Old Dominion." "Come, Captain, let us give the horses a chance to prove their blood. These roads will be paced in a few hours." The dawn was breaking sullenly, and out of a gray, low-hanging mist a light rain fell in the soft, monotonous fashion of mountain rain. Much of the time it was necessary to maintain single file, and Armitage rode ahead. The fog grew thicker as they advanced, but they did not lessen their pace, which had now dropped to a steady trot. Suddenly, as they swept on beyond Lamar, they heard the beat of hoofs and halted. "Bully for us! We've cut in ahead of them. Can you count them, Claiborne?" "There are 3 horses, all right enough, and they're forcing the beasts. What's the word?" "Drive them back. Ready. Here we go," roared Armitage in a voice intended to be heard. They yelled at the top of their voices as they charged, plunging into the advancing trio after a 40-yard gallop. "Not later than Friday. Back you go," shouted Armitage, and laughed aloud at the enemy's rout. One of the horses, it seemed from the rider's yells to be Chauvenet's, turned and bolted, and the others followed, back the way they had come. Soon they dropped their pace to a trot, but the trio continued to fly before them. "They're rattled," said Claiborne, "and the fog isn't helping them any." "We're getting close to my place," said Armitage, and as he spoke 2 shots fired in rapid succession, cracking faintly through the fog, and they jerked up their horses. "It's Oscar. He's a good way ahead, if I judge the shots right." "If he turns them back, we ought to hear their horses in a moment," observed Claiborne. "The fog muffles sound. The road's pretty level here." "We must get them out of it and into my territory for safety. We're within a mile of the gate, and we ought to be able to crowd them into that long open strip where the fences are down. Damn the fog!" The agreed signal of 2 shots reached them again, but clearer, like drum taps, and was immediately answered by scattering shots. A moment later, as the 2 riders moved forward at a walk, a sharp volley rang out quite clearly, and they heard shouts and the crack of revolvers again. "By George! They're coming! Here we go!" They put their horses to the gallop and rode swiftly through the fog. The beat of hoofs was now perfectly audible ahead of them, and they heard, quite distinctly, a single revolver snap twice. "Oscar has them on the run! Bully for Oscar! They're getting close. Thank the Lord for this level stretch. Now howl and let her go!" They went forward with a yell that broke weirdly and chokingly on the gray cloak of fog, their horses' hoofs pounding dully on the earthen road. The rain had almost ceased, but enough had fallen to soften the ground. "They're terribly brave, or horribly scared from their speed," shouted Claiborne. "Now for it!" They rose up in their stirrups and charged, yelling lustily, riding neck and neck toward the unseen foe, and with their horses at their highest pace, they broke upon the mounted trio that now rode upon them grayly out of the mist. There was a mad snorting and shrinking of horses. One of the animals turned and tried to bolt, and his rider, struggling to control him, added to the confusion. The fog shut them in with each other, and Armitage and Claiborne, having flung back their own horses at the onset, had an instant's glimpse of Chauvenet trying to swing his horse into the road, of Zmai half turning, as his horse reared, to listen for the foe behind, and of Durand's impassive white face as he steadied his horse with his left hand and leveled a revolver at Armitage with his right. With a cry, Claiborne put spurs to his horse and drove him forward upon Durand. His hand knocked the levelled revolver flying into the fog. Then Zmai fired twice, and Chauvenet's frightened horse, panic-stricken at the shots, reared, swung round, and dashed back the way he had come, and Durand and Zmai followed. The three disappeared into the mist, and Armitage and Claiborne shook themselves together and quieted their horses. "That was too close for fun. Are you all there?" asked Armitage. "Still in it, but Chauvenet's friend won't miss every time. There's murder in his eye. The big fellow seemed to be trying to shoot his own horse." "Oh, he's a knife-and-sack man, and clumsy with the gun." They moved slowly forward now, and Armitage sent his horse across the rough ditch at the roadside to get his bearings. The fog seemed at the point of breaking, and the mass about them shifted and drifted in the growing light. "This is my land, sure enough. Lord, man, I wish you'd get out of this and go home. You see they're an ugly lot, and don't use toy pistols." "Remember the potato sack. That's my watchword," laughed Claiborne. They rode with their eyes straight ahead, peering through the breaking, floating mist. It was now so clear and light that they could see the wood at either hand, though 50 yards ahead in every direction the fog still lay like a barricade. "I should value a change of raiment," observed Armitage. "There was an advantage in armor. Your duds might get rusty on a damp excursion, but your shirt won't stick to your hide." "Who cares? Those devils are pretty quiet, and the little sergeant is about due to bump into them again." They had come to a gradual turn in the road at a point where a steep, wooded incline swept up on the left. On the right lay the old hunting preserve and Armitage's bungalow. As they drew into the curve they heard a revolver crack twice, as before, followed by answering shots, and cries and the thump of hoofs. "Ooh-wee! Oscar has struck them again. Steady now, watch your horse," and Armitage raised his arm high above his head and fired twice as a warning to Oscar. The distance between the contending parties was shorter now than at the first meeting, and Armitage and Claiborne bent forward in their saddles, talking softly to their horses, that had danced wildly at Armitage's shots. "Lord, if we can crowd them in here now and back to the port." "There!" Exclamations died on their lips at that instant. Ahead of them lay the fog, rising and breaking in soft folds, and behind it men yelled and several shots snapped spitefully on the heavy air. Then a curious picture disclosed itself just at the edge of the vapor, as though it were a curtain through which the actors in a drama emerge upon a stage. Zmai and Chauvenet flashed into view suddenly, and close behind them Oscar, yelling like mad. He drove his horse between the two men, threw himself flat as Zmai fired at him, and turned and waved his hat and laughed at them. Then, just before his horse reached Claiborne and Armitage, he checked its speed abruptly, flung it about, and then charged back, still yelling upon the amazed foe. "He's crazy. He's gone clean out of his head," muttered Claiborne, restraining his horse with difficulty. "What do you make of it?" "He's having fun with them. He's just rattling them to warm himself up, the little beggar. I didn't know it was in him." Back went Oscar toward the two horsemen he had passed less than a minute before, still yelling, and this time he discharged his revolver with seeming unconcern for the value of ammunition, and as he again dashed between them and back through the gray curtain, Armitage gave the word, and he and Claiborne swept on at a gallop. Durand was out of sight, and Chauvenet turned and looked behind him uneasily. Then he spoke sharply to Zmai. Oscar's wild ride back and forth had demoralized the horses, which were snorting and plunging wildly. As Armitage and Claiborne advanced, Chauvenet spoke again to Zmai and drew his own revolver. "Oh, for a saber now," growled Claiborne. But it was not a moment for speculation or regret. Both sides were perfectly silent as Claiborne, leading slightly, with Armitage pressing close at his left, galloped toward the two men who faced them at the gray wall of mist. They bore to the left with a view of crowding the two horsemen off the road and into the preserve, and as they neared them they heard cries through the mist and rapid hoof-beats, and Durand's horse leaped the ditch at the roadside just before it reached Chauvenet and Zmai and ran away through the rough underbrush into the wood, Oscar close behind and silent now, grimly intent on his business. The revolvers of Zmai and Chauvenet cracked together, and they, too, turned their horses into the wood, and away they all went, leaving the road clear. "My horse got it that time," shouted Claiborne. "So did I," replied Armitage. "But never you mind, old man. We've got them cornered now." Claiborne glanced at Armitage and saw his right hand, still holding his revolver, go to his shoulder. "Much damage?" "It struck a hard place. But I am still fit." The blood streamed from the neck of Claiborne's horse, which threw up its head and snorted in pain, but kept bravely on at the trot in which Armitage had set the pace. "Poor devil! We'll have a reckoning pretty soon," cried Armitage cheerily. "No kingdom is worth a good horse." They advanced at a trot toward the port. "You'll be afoot any minute now, but we're in good shape and on our own soil, with those carrion between us and a gap they won't care to drop into. I'm off for the gate. You wait here, and if Oscar fires the signal, give the answer." Armitage galloped off to the right, and Claiborne jumped from his horse just as the wounded animal trembled for a moment, sank to its knees, and rolled over dead. Chapter 24.